What's up, everybody? This is Attorney Davis Younts. I am here with Byrd, and we are going to be talking about DEI in the military and is it really dead? So, we've all been watching President Trump's executive orders. We've all been watching the first few weeks of Secretary Hegseth in the Department of Defense and what he's doing. But here's the reality. The reality is, particularly over the last 4 years, a lot of really, really good people had their careers ended or careers destroyed because of progressive woke ideology and just DEI programs being run amok and being run in such a way that people with traditional common sense values, biblical faith were the targets of discrimination and persecution. So, the real question is, what do we do now, and how do we push back, and how do we make things right for people who served in the military, who served well, but simply got caught up in the purge and the pogrom to rid the military of so many good people. So, how I want to intro this is I just want to give a couple of examples. I'm going to start with a couple. I'm going to let Caleb give a couple of examples of things that we've seen. These are all based on real cases, real incidents, real facts. We're going to protect information that would divulge attorney-client privilege, of course, but we're going to talk about real facts and circumstances. And after we have a chance to talk about that for a few minutes, we'll talk about the way forward and some of the things we hope to see happen, as well as how to make these things right. So I can think of a lot of examples of clients that we have helped throughout the last 4 or 5 years deal with these things, but they're very simple things. Let me give you a couple of examples of things we've seen that have been deemed to either run afoul of a DEI policy or run afoul of an extremist policy. So on the lower end of things or circumstances of a client, more than one client, but I can think of one Army client in particular, Army officer, impeccable career, who got in huge trouble because he publicly made comments about his disagreement with lowering standards for PT tests. And he said it in the context of, the idea the Navy was lowering standards, other branches were lowering standards in order to allow more recruits to come in. And he was also saying it in terms of the frustration you see in combat units and combat arms units when they have to pick up the slack for someone who's not meeting the standards. And typically that's a female who cannot meet the same standards as a male in those units. And when she cannot, if she cannot, how that can impact the mission and what's happening. So all he did, not in a disrespectful way, not in a way of trying to bring anyone down or anything else. He just asked questions, made some comments about standards, and he faced an administrative separation board and adverse action because of that. That's kind of wow, that seems like common sense. Secretary Hegseth talked about some of those same principles before his confirmation and in his confirmation hearing. And then you have the other extreme where we have people who are being accused of being extremists because of simple things they've done. We had a client whose security clearance was threatened. They tried to pull his security clearance because he had an appeal to heaven flag, the old pine tree flag. It's a symbol. It's part of our nation's history. It's part of the Revolutionary War history. He had that on his social media post. And also he posted a picture of his church where he went, and they had that flag displayed over the stage where the preacher, the pastor, was preaching from, and it was displayed above an American flag. So because of that, he was labeled an extremist. He was tied to extremism somehow, and they attempted to take away his security clearance. He saved it, but so you have this continuum, or this scale of DEI on one side, and you also have the abuse of what the military has called anti-extremism policies that have been used to target people with traditional American values, traditional beliefs, traditional historical positions, as well as what we would consider basic views of gender and human sexuality from a biblical perspective. So again, as you look at this continuum, you have people like our client, Major Worley in Idaho, who was fired from his position simply because a year before, when he was running for office, he had said things consistent with a biblical view of marriage and that got him fired. So those are just a few of the examples we've seen over the last 4 years, and how that's happened. So Caleb, is there any examples you wanted to share, or any of those you wanted to talk about a little further?
Yeah, I mean, we have all kind of examples. I think probably some of my favorite ones are clients who have memed themselves out of the military. So just sharing dank memes online. This was part of what the military was really attacking. Like they were literally going through people's social media accounts trying to figure out um, what posts were you liking, what posts were you sharing. Uh, it so many of these examples are things that would just be otherwise considered very nitpicky, innocent things, innocent memes that 5, 10 years ago no one would have thought anything about. It's probably the memes that are in your group chat right now. And so the problem that we have seen is it very much felt like post COVID. It's like COVID was round one of trying to get as many conservative Christians out of the military as possible. And then that was
Right.
followed up with round two, which was effectively the DoD and particularly the Army attempting to label Christians and conservatives as extremists.
Right. Yeah, and I think what I've tried to emphasize is the DoD policy, the anti-extremism policy uses language. It uses this language, it uses definition and terms that talk about, a example of an extremist position would be someone who advocates, or an extremist group would be a group that advocates for limiting, this is my favorite language that they came up with, limiting the rights of others.
Yeah, and
What do they really mean?
yeah. And I've actually got it pulled up. So one of the things I did in preparation for this, I actually pulled up the DoD policy because and
Right.
the Army policy, and I actually want to talk through that just a little bit. So this
Let's
is
do that.
the Army directive that was passed in June of this last year, right? So this was
Right.
implemented June 14th, 2024. And
Right.
so the actual language is advocating advocating widespread unlawful discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including pregnancy, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And it's very, very difficult for the Army to argue that this was not targeted at Christians when just a few paragraphs under that, they define active participation in extremist groups
Exactly.
as fundraising or making personal contributions through donations to a group or organization that engages in any of the above activities with the intent to support those activities. So imagine, if you will, a Orthodox Christian believer in the Army who attends a church that advocates against homosexuality, advocates against homosexual marriage, uh, you know, uh, sends street preachers out to protest at abortion clinics to save children. Um, if you tithe to that church and you're in the Army, you are potentially liable to be labeled an extremist. And over the last 4 years, what that means is you're going to lose your security clearance, you're going to lose your job, and you're potentially going to lose your career in the military because you went to church and you tithed faithfully to a church that upheld traditional Christian values.
So you're telling me when my church organized a prayer meeting outside of a public library where they were doing a drag queen story hour, that could be perceived as an extremist activity, and I could have gotten in trouble for tithing to my church?
I don't think there is any question under the Army's directive that that's exactly how this was intended to be used, because that would fall directly under advocating against someone on the basis of their general gender identity or sexual orientation.
Right. So, and it's that advocacy for the limitation of rights, right? To limit
Yes,
someone else's rights. So they do, and I mean, they use language about unlawful discrimination and all of those things, but then they use examples and they use definitions, and it's, that limitation of rights is what bothers me, because if you're advocating for a traditional view of marriage, human sexuality, a biblical view of that, then you're arguing for the limitation of rights. And they even throw in their reproductive rights, right?
that's right.
Pregnancy, reproductive rights. So that's where you have this idea, if you're potentially giving to an organization that's a pro-life organization that's advocating against or to limit the murder of unborn children, and you fall into that, and that's many churches. So we don't know yet. So I want to kind of transition and talk about the future a little bit. We have seen the devastating impact of this on military members to the point where we have clients who, because of memes they posted or they were alleged to have posted, they got a visit from the FBI.
Oh,
We
yeah.
have another client that just comments about women in combat and comments about being opposed to drafting, selective service and drafting women. They got visited by the FBI. I'll say it again. I've said it publicly, over my dead body, will my daughters be drafted involuntarily into military service? That's a hard no for me as a father. And yet that's the kind of comment that got one of our clients a visit from the FBI.
And by the way, let me just point out, let's talk about how innocuous these comments are. These are the exact same comments that the Secretary of Defense said before Congress. It's
right.
Literally, the comments were, standards matter. We should not be lowering standards for women to be in combat roles, which is exactly what we have done over the last decade. It's inexcusable. It's been public for anyone who's been paying attention. Those were the comments.
Right.
Those were the comments. Right. It was not even anything like women shouldn't be in the military. Women shouldn't be able to put on a uniform. No, it was, we shouldn't lower standards for women to be in these combat roles. That's it. That's all we're talking about.
Right. And so all that's to say, what do we do now? How do we dig out from this mess that we've gotten ourselves into? One of the things that we are advocating for, one of the things we're hoping to see happen, both through our law firm as well as with Stand With Warriors, is all of these anti-extremism policies that were designed and set up to, I believe, entrap Christians and just purge people with these traditional values from the military, and just, use the military as a means, as a social experiment to further social change and force adoption of these extremist views, these radical views, these unbiblical views of human sexuality, gender, all of these things. We need to get rid of those policies, right? So those have to be rooted out. Those have to be pulled out. Those have to be pulled aside. And, people may disagree about how big of a deal it is to put pronouns in an email. And why would Trump issue that order? Why would Secretary Hegseth make that a priority? What people don't understand is, in the last administration, the Department of Health and Human Services under Admiral Rachel, aka Dick Levine, under that administration, they enacted a radical, tyrannical pronoun policy. In other words, you were deemed to be engaged in misconduct if you didn't participate in their mental health issues with regard to pronoun usage and other things. And so that was what we were seeing. I think HHS was a test, and we had clients within HHS, and we push back. They never enforced it, but it was absolutely one of those things where they were dipping their toe in the water to see how far can we push this before there's an uproar. So that's what was coming. So now we have to go through all layers of, the tyrannical bureaucracy of the federal government and the military and rip those policies out and go back to, common sense, constitutional, basic principles. We treat everyone equally before God, and we don't target people simply because of their religious beliefs or simply because they're not a, woke Marxist communist. And we're not going to force people to engage in fraud by acknowledging, some mental illness in a combat setting or anywhere in the military. That doesn't help us do our job. And there's so many practical reasons, and I'm going off on a tangent, but when we talk about the priority of the war fighter, we talk about, lethality and combat readiness. Someone who is going through gender transitions and gender transition surgeries, that makes them not deployable. That makes them not fit for service. And the military was recruiting those people and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to give them their hormones and to pay at taxpayer expense for these surgeries. That's what was happening. So those are the things we need to stop. So I'll let you comment on that before I start pounding on the table.
Well, let me give you a really good example. Most people who've never even in the military, if you've never deployed, this is not intuitively obvious. Okay. Most people don't realize this. You cannot deploy in the military if you are on any type of injection on a regular basis.
Right.
So let me give you an example. One of my really good friends from the military, he suffered from severe migraines, and we
Mm,
were getting ready to deploy. Um, and his deployment status was almost taken away because he had been placed on a new treatment for his migraines that involved a monthly injection.
right.
Because, and this was only a monthly injection. It was not a daily injection, like if you think like insulin issues or something like that. So it was a monthly injection. And he was informed, hey, if your doctor doesn't change your prescription, we're not going to let you employ because you cannot be on any type of injectables and in a deployed environment because there's no way that we can safely provide storage for the medicine that you need. And so luckily he was able to get that sorted out, move over to a prescription, which allowed him to deploy. But people don't understand when it comes to transgenders in the military, especially if you're going through any kind of hormone replacement post-op care, they are on so much medication, they are permanently physically undeployable. Which
That's
means
right.
if we go to World War III and we're all having to invade Russia and you and I get called back into the force because everyone is going, you still cannot take the transgenders. They are
Right.
non-deployable. They are in a medical status that prevents them from being able to deploy. And the typical person in the military, particularly Army and Marine Corps, for example, if you're non-deployable for 12 months or more, you're placed in a medical hold and you're medically discharged out of the military.
Right. So just from a, again, from a sheer logic standpoint, so people can understand this from a military readiness standpoint, this idea that we would recruit transgender people and then use taxpayer dollars to pay for their transition, take anything other than the practicality of that from a military readiness standpoint, and it's absurd that we would be wasting money that should be going to equipment, training, bullets, guns, and wasting it on that stuff is just it's beyond the pale. The problem is, in the last 4 or 5 years, if you said that out loud and you were in the military, you risked being labeled an extremist, you risk being labeled a bigot, and it could have devastating consequences to your career. So what I want to talk about now is, now what?
Yeah.
So the reality is there are many people, some you may know, some you may have served with, who are either kicked out or dealing with adverse paperwork in their records from as a result of these anti-extremism or these DEI policies, and they're still left over. So we have clients that were, under investigation for something that happened before the election or before the new administration came in, and they're still dealing with the consequences of that. So one of the things I want to share with you is, look, if that's where you fit in, if you were subjected to this kind of persecution through one of these policies or as a result of one of these policies or politically incorrect statements, whatever it is, there are paths to getting restoration. If you were kicked out, it may be through the discharge review board. If it's an issue of your record, not being promoted, being removed from command, other disciplinary action that may have been taken against you, we can go to the Board of Corrections for Military Records and address those cases. And here's the reality. For the first time in a long time, this is the best time to file those requests, because for the next 4 years, you're going to have this window of new leadership throughout the Department of Defense and each service that is going to be sympathetic to these cases and is going to understand, wow, this was an overreaction. Just like, we've seen the FBI going after people who were, praying outside of abortion clinics, people that walked across the grass on January 6th. We've seen that overreaction. Well, now we have leadership in the DoD that recognizes that. And I think they're going to be prepared through the board process we already have in place to grant relief to people. But, I think it is important timing wise to get those applications in as soon as possible, because this can be a very long process. But I think that's the path forward. So that's what we're going to be looking at for a lot of our clients. We're going to be really interested in talking to others to try to bring these forward. And maybe there will be enough people that come together so that this can turn into a class action or can turn into a special board. But until those applications get submitted, we can't get that critical mass that we need. So that's kind of what I've been thinking. Is there anything else on that you wanted to add, Caleb, or other thoughts you had about that as we look forward?
Yeah, so I think from a policy perspective, I think you and I are really, really pleased with what Secretary Hegseth has already done. I mean, getting rid of um, celebrating particular months for people group in the military, I thought was a huge first step. Anyone who's been in the military understands the absolute like gluttonous environment it was for DEI. Every single month, sometimes it felt like you had different weeks where we were trying to celebrate some obscure ethnicity or race or whatever else. And so Secretary Hegseth coming in, putting an absolute end to that was phenomenal. It was a step in the right direction. But
Can we,
my
can we, I want to drill down on that just a little
yeah,
further. So I want to talk about that because the
yeah,
policy Hegseth said is we're not using appropriated funds, meaning funds that are
or
supposed to
Tom.
be going to fight wars to pay for any whatever it is, Irish American Special Heritage Month, whatever that month is, that we're not going to do that.
That's
But I
right.
don't think people that haven't served in the military. So my experience in the Air Force side was like people would get achievement medals
Hmm.
for being a volunteer on the Irish Island Heritage Month committee and they'd spend 20 out of 30 work days in a month spending all their time on setting up a lunch or a committee or something else rather than doing their job, and everybody else was having to pick up the slack, and then they get an achievement medal or something else out of it for doing that. Was that what you were seeing in the Army? Was just
Oh
tremendous
yeah.
waste of resources?
You want to talk about waste of resources. So so typically at the installations I worked at, when you went into the command headquarters, the HR department would always set up a booth where
Mm,
whatever Pacific Islander month, left-handed people month, like whatever ridiculous thing we're celebrating, they would set up a booth with like flyers and a poster board and look like some fifth grade science fair model right there as you walk into the headquarters, where to go to whatever your command briefing is, and it's constantly changing. So just that alone, that I mean, you had literally uniform HR personnel spending hours a month of time creating these projects to put in the front of the building for whatever month or week or day we're celebrating. And it was an absolutely, when I say gluttonous, I mean gluttonous. It was a gluttonous waste of time and resources that could have otherwise been devoted to training and equipping and getting ready for war fighting. And then of course, you had you were constantly getting emails to get pulled out of your actual job and your actual duties to go to some lunch, to go to some meeting, to go to some town hall based on this or that. And it was one of those things that in the military, nothing is ever voluntary, right? So when
right.
they tell you, hey, we're going to do a voluntary lunch for this particular people group month at this time, and the commander wants to invite everyone there. That's not a request, right?
No,
It's
it's
not a
mandatory.
it's a mandatory. It's a
you've
mandatory
been,
lunch,
yeah, you've been voluntold
right? You've been
to
voluntold
go.
to leave your job to leave your duty, to
Right.
go to some massive time suck lunch to get rubber chicken at the DFAC, and
Mhm.
to hear someone give their DEI speech. And so I think that it was a huge first step. And by the way, this is a dream come true. You and I have joked that the sun would part, the clouds would part, and the sun would come through the clouds when we got rid of these stupid months. And the fact
Right.
that Pete Hegseth did it on like day 2 was
Right.
absolutely phenomenal. But my concern when it comes to DEI is it is Hydra. And
Right.
when you cut the head off the snake, 2 more grow back. And
Right.
what they're really going to have to do is get in there and cauterize what they're killing. And if you
Right.
don't do that and you don't follow it up, one of the things that they've already recognized that people have been trying to do is change names from diversity to, DEI to ESG is what the corporate
Right.
mottos are. You know, there's been great examples of diversity. DEI officer is now like executive director of outreach or some craziness. And so the problem is you really have to get in there and you have to smoke out these people and these policies that have put in place over the last 4 years, because it really is a hydra. And if you don't get in there and cauterize what you kill, it's going to grow back and it's going to be even bigger.
Right. And this is not about racism. This is not about discrimination. This is about a waste of money and using the military to enact social change in a way that is, furthering progressive ideology, furthering secular humanism, rather than focusing on training and doing what we need to do. So, this isn't the time or the video to do this, but there's a lot of waste and just dead weight that needs to be cut out of the Department of Defense anyway. But this is all kind of part of it. I appreciate that, Caleb, because I wanted everybody to understand, as we think about, the future, we think about changing the culture. I don't think the American people, the taxpayers, had any idea how much time and effort and money and resources were wasted on things that have nothing to do with our lethality. That doesn't mean we don't celebrate the Tuskegee Airmen. That doesn't mean we don't celebrate the diverse and wonderful history of our military, but it's always been about excellence. It's always been about merit. It's always been about demonstrated standards that bring people together, because once the bullets start flying, you don't care whether the person's from Cincinnati or Brooklyn. You just want them to be able to join the fight beside you and do their job. That's what any of us care about in the military. And it doesn't matter if that's in the combat or in the courtroom, right? And you and I have experienced that. So we can celebrate our history. We can celebrate all those things well. But when we take this emphasis and this constant, if we go to a lunch, then we feel good about ourselves, or we waste all this money and resources, it gives us this opportunity to not do hard things that actually take to build relationships and bring everybody to standards and do things the right way. It's just a Band-Aid on a larger problem, and it's a complete waste of resources. So all that is to say, listen, we really appreciate you taking the time to watch this, to spend a little time with us. We are definitely going to be looking at this from a policy standpoint. Be on the lookout for more information from Stand With Warriors, standwithwarriors.org. That's the nonprofit that was started by pastors and Navy SEALs to address the purge of Christians during COVID. That is just going to be growing and moving out to help the new administration, help Secretary Hegseth get rid of and kill Hydra once and for all in this. And then on the law firm front, on the legal front, for us, we have many clients that we're going to be working through the discharge upgrade and the Board of Corrections process. And so if you are someone who, or someone who is impacted by anti-extremism, DEI, out of control, woke, progressive, political correctness, and that has impacted your military career, reach out to us, shoot us an email. Let's have a conversation. Let's see if we can make your case part of the solution moving forward. And that's going to be our goal and what we're here for. So Caleb, I will let you have the last word and take us out today.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of work that's left to be done. We've got a great opportunity here for the next minimum 4 years to really advance the ball. Now is really the time to go on the offensive and start pushing back and start pressing better policies, better procedures. And so really this is now the time, if you or someone has been affected by these policies, now is the time to really start pushing back and pursuing those legal avenues to try to get corrections. And we would love to be able to help you work through any of these issues.
We're ready. Let's go.
Let's go.
All right. God bless. Take care.
Left to men like Davis Younts fighting for these Navy SEALs. Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officers.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending.
Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant